Hello and welcome back to another episode of Let's Build an E-commerce Store with a Spring Boot backend. This is episode 8, and we're going to be focusing on endpoint security. So what's the objectives of today? We've got, firstly, we're going to make all endpoints secured by authentication by default. So if you try and access any endpoint on our system, and it's one that is an actual endpoint. It's not like you typed in /abc123 and it doesn't exist. If it's an actual endpoint, we will check to see if there is an authentication principle provided already, and if not, we're going to reject it with a 401 error saying that it's unauthorized. Secondly, we're going to put in exclusions to require authentication on specific endpoints because it's an e-commerce store. Things like products are going to come up on the front home page without you needing to be signed in. So we want to be able to access those without a specific user authentication. And then finally, we're going to test our authentication on those endpoints work. So before we go over to our development environment, let's have a think about the second objective that we have here. So putting the exclusions in. What are our current endpoints and what the exclusions we would need are? So at the moment we've got roughly five endpoints. We've got our login endpoint, the registration endpoint, the auth/me endpoint, the products, and the orders. So first, the login page. Well, you need to log in to be able to authenticate. So that's going to require an exclusion. The registration page, again, you would need to exclude that. The auth/me page, you would need an authentication to access that, otherwise it's not going to return any data. So that page will not be excluded. Then you've got the products page, as we said before, you don't need to be logged in for that, so we want to exclude that. And then finally the orders page, again the orders is related to the user, so there's no way we can actually provide the orders page without the authentication in place. So that won't be excluded. So now we had a thought about our exclusions, let's go to the development environment and get started. Okay, so as usual, here we are in our development environment. So we're back here where we were last episode. So the first things first in our objectives of the day was to outright block every request if it wasn't authenticated. So let's go to our web security config, and you may remember at one point we created this class and I said this is just some dummy code that we need to put in just to make things work for now, and we created this code and I said don't worry about it, we'll go over it later. So this is the time we're actually going to start using this. So we're creating a configuration class called web security config. Now this is purely just to configure the Spring MVC security element. That's why we annotate it at configuration. And what we do is we create a security filter chain bean, and what that does is it creates the filter chain. So where we had our JWT request filter, this is a security filter, and a filter chain is at the point in which someone requests to access our REST API. They send the request, and when we process that request, if you have a security filter chain, it will go through the things that you define here in this HTTP security. It will go through these element by element to verify and to check the request is valid before putting it through to the controller. So what we do is we create a security filter chain bean to replace the default one that Spring Boot creates, and that allows us to use the HTTP security created bean by Spring to configure it. So what we're doing is we're saying CSRF, which is a method of verifying where code is coming from, as in is it the same front end right in the code. It's a security feature. We're disabling that just so that when we run our own REST API calls, we don't have to do anything extra. Cause is another one, which is cross-origin reference site. or I think it's something along those lines. My memory is a bit vague on that. Where are we? The code last. Of course, it doesn't say there, but yeah, it's another security method because when a browser queries or calls to a REST API, it attaches the origin. So the origin is the domain which the code is being called from. So if I have example.com, well, my origin will be example.com, and CORS allows you to say only accept requests from example.com, for example. And you can obviously configure this down to individual levels of controller. You could configure it down to individual paths, individual request types. But again, we're disabling that. We may do an episode later on to do with that, but we're not going to do. We're just going to leave that disabled for now. Obviously, we have our to-do message here. We're going to just remove that. And then this is the bit that we're actually focusing on today. So the authorized HTTP requests. So this is where you do your authorization checks. So as you can see here, we've got any request, permit all. All right, now I'm going to drop this line down because it just makes it look a bit neater going forward. So at the moment, we're saying on any request that we get, permit all request types. So get, post, delete, whatever. Well, we now know that what we want to do is actually default it to authenticated. So that will say, is there an authentication set in the is there an authentication set in the security context? So in our filter, for example, down here, the JWT filter we built in the last episode, the episode before, you can see here we create this authentication object and we set it to the security context as the authentication. So it's checking to see if this exists, and then inside the authentication interface, if we go down to that, the authentication interface, there is a is authenticated flag, so it checks this. Now by default that's true in the implementation we're using, so it's always going to be true. So so now that we've done that, let's quickly start up our application. And we're going to go into Postman, and this is the products page we were talking about earlier, where we said if it's a product, then we don't need authentication for that. So I've got my authentication set to no auth, and I'm going to hit send. And as you see, I get 403 forbidden because the authentication is not set. But if I were to come in here and go bear a token and leave that token from the previous episode, I've still got 403 forbidden. Now, how can we try and figure out what's going on here? Well, first, let's try and figure out, do we even have a authentication being set? So let's put a debug point here and start the application debug mode. As you see, it's loading up. And if I now hit send, I've got the 403 forbidden again, but our debug point here never was reached, which means that this code isn't actually being called, which must mean that this section here, where we check to see if any request is authenticated, that's actually being called before our filter is being called, because it's part of a filter chain, remember. So the filter chain says I have a chain of filters and I start from the top one, and if any of them reject it, then I cut out straight away, and it's obviously in the wrong order. So how can we fix this? Well, if we come in here and we set a private field for our JWT request filter, and we just call it JWT request filter, and then we're going to have Spring inject that through the constructor. Now we have it in hand, what we can do is come down here and we go http.add filter. Now what the filter chain does normally is it can search for all the beans that implement filter, and it will then add those in automatically. But what we're going to do is we're going to use the manual way of adding it, and as you can see here, we can go add filter, but we don't want that one. We want add filter before. We've got our JWT request filter. And if we look in HTTP build, oh no, sorry, that's not the one, is it? If we go, I think it's in, is it this one? Oh, I had it earlier, I'm just trying to figure out where it is. This is it. Oh, I can't remember exactly where it is. But essentially, the this HTTP security thing, when you build it, what it does is it adds a filter chain for it does a filter chain for. Sorry, I thought I might have found it there, but never mind. For a filter called authorization filter. Let me just put .class. So what this line says is, hello, Mr. Chain. Can I please have a filter added? Here's my filter that I want to add, the instance of it, and I want to add it in before the authorization filter. Anything that implements this type. So what this means is that we're going to run this request filter before the authorization filter is ever run. So now if we try and run this again, we're going to run it as debug as well, just so that we can double check that our code is being called. And we're going to come in here and we're going to hit send again. And as you can see, we've actually hit our breakpoint. So we can remove that now because we know we're calling it. To continue the program on, we hit F9 and then IntelliJ. And you can see now the products are appearing. And if I go back and I go no auth and send again, we're still getting the 403 forbidden. So that's where we now need to think about how do we put in exemptions. So what we have to do is we have to do a request matcher, and we can go /product.permitAll, and we're not doing semicolons here because we're just following on. It's just that they're on separate lines. So now we've got request matcher product. So anything that is /product in the path, then we just allow it to go through. So let's rerun this again. And fingers crossed, we can now hit send. Oh, it's not ready yet. There we go. Send. And you can see we've got no authentication being provided, but we still got our list of products. And let's go over to our order one. And we're going to turn the authentication off and send that. And as you can see, our orders are still being rejected. So again, let's go in and put in the other exemptions that we were talking about earlier. So we've got auth/register and permit all, and we've got auth/login permit all. So now if we hit any of these, we're going to permit. I think are you able to do that? I can't remember. Oh no, wait, that's it. You can. I think. I'm just trying to think of ways of doing this more efficiently. I think you can do it like that, actually. Let's see if that works. See, we're all experiencing something a bit new today. So let's try run that and see if that works. Oops, that still works. And if we try and run the login, that still works. Yeah, so it's even easier. You could just do it all in one single one. So if anything in here is the path that we're requesting, we allow it. Otherwise, we get caught by this any request, and we make sure they're authenticated. So there we go. We've done it. Now we can test again as well to make sure that the auth one, so auth me, if I send that with the authentication enabled, you can see that I get my result 200, all good. But if I change it to no auth and I send it, I get 403. So you can also think about this as from the front end point of view. When I have logged in the user and I get my token, I might store it somewhere in like a cookie, or I might store it in the local storage on the browser somewhere, so that the next time the user opens a website, we try and automatically theoretically log them in. But actually what you're just using is you're using the exact same login token from before. It's just that you're instead requesting to what is it, the words I'm trying to think of. you're just checking that the token still exists. Well, you could use the /me endpoint to fetch the profile of the user so that you get your front end display stuff up. Like, for example, if you had the user's username in the top right, you can use that, but also you can use it as a way of figuring out if the token is still valid or if they're supposed to be logged out or whatever. So you can see there, 403 forbidden, it shows that that if I were to have an expired token or there was a dodgy token or something being used, well, 403 forbidden would help me, notice that from a programmatical way. So there we go. That's it really. It's hopefully a little bit of a shorter episode, this one. So we've done our three objectives. Firstly, we defaulted everything to be rejected if you're not authorized. Secondly, we made some exclusions for certain endpoints, and then finally we tested to make sure that they're correctly authenticating each endpoint. So as always, remember on my channel there is a playlist with all of the videos for this tutorial series in one go. Please feel free to subscribe and like the video, it helps me greatly. You'll find in the description, as always, the start and end point in the GitHub for this episode. And yeah, thank you very much for watching, and I hope you join me for the next episode. Thank you very much. Bye.